Hey, it's Aaron, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about anarchist symbolism. But first, I am going to give you a bit of an update on my spaghetti situation, considering the last time I was in my kitchen, I made a lot of people pretty worried about me and my spaghetti. So I will let you know, just for the record, the spaghetti was delicious. So thank you very much for asking. And like I was saying, today we're going to talk a little bit about anarchist symbolism. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this today is because a lot of people recently, in the last couple of videos, have made mention about this little hat that I've been wearing. It's a nice hat. It's called a kepi hat. It's got the little flat top on here. It's got a little skull and crossbones on the front. It's a neat hat. I like it a lot. And the kepi hat has a lot of history, a lot of symbolism within itself. It was worn by the Northern Army when they were fighting against the Southern Army in the United States during the Civil War to free the slaves. And also it's in black with a skull and crossbones on it. Obviously, black is the color of anarchy, and skull and crossbones have all kinds of meanings. So a lot of people were asking me about this silly little hat that I was wearing. And some people were even asking, are you a bad guy now because you're wearing skulls and crossbones? No, I've always worn those, but let's talk a little bit about symbolism since it was brought up. So to talk a little bit about symbolism, and specifically anarchist symbolism, we're going to have to go all the way back to ancient Rome. Because, well, that's basically where the first anarchist symbols kind of derived from. Now, during the times of the ancient Roman period, whenever there was a slave that was freed, they would be presented with a hat. Kind of weird, but back in those days, there were a lot of different types of hats for different types of people, and they used to give each type of person a different type of hat so they could tell what that person was. I know the Jews had a specific Jewish hat, and the freed slaves also had a freedom hat, or a liberty hat as it was called. And eventually, over time, this liberty hat evolved and became something known as a rouge bonnet, I believe it was called, or a red hat. Basically, a Phrygian hat, which is kind of like a Smurf's cap that sits on the top of your head and is kind of pointed, but a little bit canted over, kind of floppy. Very similar to something that, say, Santa Claus would wear, or a little shorter. And it was always considered to be a symbol of freedom, of liberty, which is basically the name, a liberty hat. And eventually it was looked at as being a rather important symbol all across Europe, specifically in France, but like I say, all across Europe. And this hat went on to symbolize the freeing of people, basically allowing the people who were under the oppression of the kings or of the aristocracy to be able to have their ability to breathe free. This was very much adopted, not only all across Europe, but in the United States as well, when they were fighting for their ability to get away from the British rule, to basically fight for their independence. They very much used this red hat as a symbol of their liberty. You would see many, many depictions of, say, Lady Liberty holding a spear with this bonnet rouge, or this little red hat, situated on top of it. And the combination of spear and hat together eventually meant that it was a freedom pole. That was basically what it turned into. A liberty pole is what they called it. And this liberty pole was a very strong symbol of American independence back in those days. The independence of the peasantry to get away from the king and away from the aristocracy and be a freed people. And you'll see all across the United States back in those times, and on coins and lots of other things, you'll see the depiction of this spear with this little red cap on the top. And it was very important, all the way up until you entered into the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, when they first formed the very first Commune of France, the French colony, they started to use a red flag in place of this bonnet rouge, this red hat on top of a pole. Now, they started using the red flag. From what I can tell, it basically started because a lot of ships were using this freedom pole, this liberty pole, and raising red flags. And when people would see these ships docking and raising this red flag, they would all come down and discuss in a group things that they needed to discuss about their situation, about freedom, about liberty, about equality, about gaining their rights. That was kind of where this whole idea originated from. So in France, during this time, they started hoisting red flags. And these red flags became a symbol all on their own. They took the symbolism of the bonnet rouge, the red caps, and brought it along to a flag. And the idea of the flag was that this piece of cloth was dragged through the streets, through the blood of the working people, and raised as a symbol of their struggle, of their fight for freedom. And of course, in France, the people really wanted that to be their flag, their national flag. But it was won over by the tricolor, the red, white, and blue like they have today. But moving forward to Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution just a little while later, you started to see these red flags being flown again. And this time, very specifically for the reasons of socialism and communism. That's basically where these red flags got their socialist and communist connotations from, was when they were being flown during the Bolshevik Revolution. Obviously, they did have connections to socialism and communism before that, obviously, but that was when they really started to take hold and really started to be a massive symbol of socialism and communism. And up until that point, even anarchists flew the red flag. But during the Bolshevik Revolution, for obvious reasons, anarchists stopped flying the red flag and went primarily to the black flag. And the black flag was flown for very much similar reasons. The red flag was always a symbol of liberty, of freedom, of equality, and also a symbol of fighting, of blood, of death, of struggling until there is no struggle left, until always fighting until the last breath. That is what the red flag meant. And in that same vein, the black flag meant a very similar thing. Black flags have always been flown in kind of this idea of fighting to the last man, not taking any prisoners, always having that struggle and that desire to win being the forefront of anything else. But the black flag also meant other things as well. It meant blood. It meant dried blood. Kind of, I guess, a nihilistic version of the red flag, whereas the red flag is fresh red blood. The black flag was the dried blood of the people who had suffered through all of these wars and through all of these struggles to get to the place that they are now. The black flag symbolizes a lot of different things. The black itself is kind of the antithesis of the white flag, a symbol of surrender, whereas the black flag was the opposite of surrender. The black flag was always a symbol of fighting till the last man, till there was no fight left. That's what the black flag always meant. It was also a symbol of misery, a symbol of death, a symbol of mourning. In fact, I believe during Kropotkin's funeral, there were miles of black flags being flown all across Red Square. I believe it was Red Square, in memoriam of Peter Kropotkin. And after that point, no black flags were ever flown again in Moscow or in the Soviet Union. Well, because they snuffed out the anarchists at that point and they were no more. But up until that point, anarchists and socialists fought hard together for the same goals. They always have. That was kind of the whole point. Now, obviously, not only does it symbolize, like I said, misery and death, it certainly did symbolize that. it also symbolizes the anti-state. Whereas in a regular country, you would fly a regular flag, a tricolor, or the Canadian flag, or the old stars and bars. Whereas when you are against the idea of states, when you're against the idea of borders and arbitrarily pushing people away and saying, this is our land, that's your land, fuck you, don't ever come to our land, flying the black flag is the antithesis of that. It is directly opposed to the idea of a nation or a border. It's the black flag, a symbol of unity among all working people, among all people in general. Like I said, it was a symbol of working people. It was a symbol of dried blood. It was a symbol of either work or death. That was also another aspect of it as well. When it was originally flown, the slogans that were being said around it was, I believe it was water, bread, and lead. These sorts of things were always being chanted whenever the black flag was flown, because you have to understand that the black flag isn't something that anarchists fly because they want to. They fly it because they have to. Like I was saying, it's a symbol against state oppression. It's a symbol against the idea of nations. It's a symbol that represents dried blood of the worker, of misery, of death, of mourning. It represents all of these terrible, horrible things, because that is the world that unfortunately anarchists have realized that we live in. We're always under oppression by capitalist structures. We're always under oppression and feeling this misery by our owners, if you will, the kings and queens of old and now the capitalists of today. We always feel that feeling. And whenever that black flag is being flown, those are the reasons why it's being flown. In complete defiance of this ruling class. Anarchists have always been against the ruling class. That's basically what anarchy means. Anarchy is against authority. Against, well, not authority, but against authoritarianism, against rulers. So that's what the black flag has always meant. And moving forward from there, you also have other things as well, such as the Anarchy A, the A with the circle around it. Now, for laymen, the Anarchy A has existed for a very long time, but it's come about a lot more in more recent times, within the last 50, 60 years, thanks not in small part to the punk movement, spray painting Anarchy A's all over the place. But the Anarchy A itself is actually really interesting and rich in history as well, though the history is much harder to find. But what we can find, and what is 100% true, is that the Anarchy A represents two things. You'll notice that it's an A with a circle around it. The A itself represents anarchy, the abolishment of all unnecessary or unjustified hierarchies and any state and oppression that happens to exist in your world. And the circle is an O for order, because intrinsically anarchists desire and need order for civilization to function. If you didn't know, anarchists are extremely interested in making things orderly. We just decided to make the way that we order things a little different. Instead of from the top down, it's from the bottom up. Now, obviously, anarchy means all those things, and that's what the Anarchy A means, but we also have a couple of other symbols as well. One that I want to touch on very briefly before I finish up, and that is the skull and crossbones. Now, the skull and crossbones was also used by anarchists in several different ways, though the anarchists that were using them wouldn't have necessarily called themselves anarchists. They were pirates. And if you look at history, pirates have always been, to certain varying degrees of certainty, more anarchistic than your regular ship captain or a regular bunch of blokes that are sailing around the ocean blue. They democratically elected their captains. They made sure that everything that happened on that ship was happening to a certain extent through a democratic means, through democracy. And they started flying symbols like the skull and crossbones. The skull and crossbones, again, very much like the black flag, is a symbol of death. It's a symbol of taking no survivors. Or taking no prisoners, sorry. We're going to fight till the last man. We're always going to make sure that our ideals are upheld, and we're going to basically do everything we possibly can to fight for those ideals. And that's basically what the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, has always represented. It, again, is another symbol that was hated by the ruling class. And it was meant to strike fear and terror into them just as soon as they see that flag being flown. They know that shit's about to go down, and we're taking this very seriously. So that's basically what a lot of different anarchist symbols mean. That's basically how we get the black flag, the red flag, and I want to end by saying that once the black and the red are finally reunited, crowned heads will tremble in fear for the rest of history. I know that's a misquote of the actual thing that Otto von Bismarck may or may not have said, but it is interesting to think about that, and that's why I always wear this little red and black bisected flag, because I know that we can only defeat the problems that we see in the world if we are working together, and that red and black finally do come back together again and fight for our freedom. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that was interesting to everybody. If I got some things wrong, please leave comments in the comment section down below, and check me out on Patreon. Every dollar does help fund this show. Thanks for watching.